Everyone, and welcome to another episode of Grey Matter. Some of you are aware that recently I've been swept up in a movement that is sweeping the land, is certainly that is rushing through Alberta, sweeping through Alberta, and is spreading to Saskatchewan and British Columbia. And this is called the Alberta Prosperity Project. We've had a couple of guests on this program already who have talked about it. In fact, Dr. Dennis Modry, who's the CEO of the project, and also Dr. Roger Hodkinson, and who could forget our good friend, Mr. Jeffrey Rath. They're all involved directly in the Alberta Prosperity Project. And the guest we have today is a scholar. His name is Dr. Michael Wagner. And he's become very involved in the Alberta Prosperity Project as well. And more as an historian and a political commentator, Michael has been speaking regularly at grassroots APP meetings that have been going on throughout Alberta. They're taking place this weekend, actually. There's 3 of them. I believe Friday is in Tofield, Saturday in Wetaskiwin, and I'll be speaking at that one. And I hope that I'll see Dr. Wagner there. And then I understand on Sunday in Ponoka. And at the same time on Saturday, Dr. Modry and co will be in Swift Current presenting to a new Saskatchewan chapter of the APP. So as you can see, this is a very exciting growing movement that is of interest not only to Albertans, but really to all Western Canadians. And Dr. Wagner is going to be able to tell us why. So as we always do, we're going to start off with a couple of aphorisms, quotations. And in the honor of our guest who's here to talk about separatism, I have one from Thomas Jefferson, who famously wrote, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them." That was part of of course, the American Declaration of Independence. Secondly, I've brought one out of Canadian history, someone who Dr. Wagner will be able to talk a little bit about. It's Clifford Sifton. That's a name who will be known probably to only people who have studied a little bit of 19th century, early 20th century Canadian history. Clifford Sifton was a man who was largely responsible for settlement and immigration of Western Canada, but he once was quoted as saying that, "I think a stalwart peasant is in a sheepskin coat, born on the soil, whose forefathers have been farmers for 10 generations, with a stout wife and a half dozen chickens, and that is a person of good quality." Well, I have to say that sounds a lot like the type of stock that most Albertans and Western Canadians come from. Dr. Wagner might agree. So who do we have? Well, Dr. Michael Wagner is an independent researcher and a writer with a PhD in political science from the University of Alberta, and we share an alma mater. He and his wife live in Edmonton, Alberta, where they have been home educating their, are you ready, 11 children. This is a very, very brave family man, and his wife is obviously a saint. He's got his own website, Michael Wagner, where you can find many, many interesting books that he has authored about Canada, especially about the West, about the importance of God in the state, which we often talk about on this program. But today we're going to talk about 2 of his books, inferentially, and then specifically at the end of our discussion. By way of introduction, though, I want to show you a couple of clips just to introduce Dr. Wagner before we get talking with him.
Desire for independence should be seen as political self-defense. We are just defending ourselves against an attack. This did not originally rise from anything that people did in Alberta. Like, we've been happy in Canada to one degree or another, for all these generations. And we were just, minding our own business when Trudeau attacked us, in the 1970s, and when Justin Trudeau is attacking us now. We did not initiate this. This didn't come from here. We're just defending ourselves. We should see this as we are defending ourselves against an attack. And Ted Byfield, who is the founder of Alberta Report magazine, he wrote this about Alberta electing the social credit government. He said, "While other provinces whined about the Depression, Alberta acted. We would not acquiesce in the misery we felt and saw around us. We would fight. We would rebel. If anything is characteristic of this province, it's that spirit of defiance. Push us far enough and we will strike back. That was our record and that is our reputation.
So I've entitled this episode, perhaps unfairly to Michael, The Separatist. Before we get into that discussion, find a little bit more about Michael, just for the edification of our viewers and listeners, I'm going to read from the Alberta Prosperity Project website. There's a beautiful vision that's contained there, and I would invite people to visit the website to find out more, because there's a lot of really tremendous information there about Alberta prosperity and why it's important for Alberta and for Western Canadians. But the vision reads like this. Our vision is for Alberta to become a new sovereign constitutional republic that recognizes the supremacy of God as foundational to an Alberta constitution, which incidentally I've been asked to work on. I'm very pleased about that. Civil society, the rule of law, and which absolutely protects Albertans' individual freedoms and rights we're in. And there's a 10-point plan here that's part of this vision. Number one, Alberta becomes the most free and prosperous nation in the world to live, work, raise a family, or start a business. That sounds awfully good. Number two, First Nations participate as founding partners. Brilliant. Number three, no Albertan is left behind. Number four, there's no need for political left or right. Boy, does that sound good. Number five, workers' rights are protected and business is allowed to thrive. Oh boy, that sounds even better. Number six, social programs are compassionate and effective. Well, the ones we have now are neither. Number seven, healthcare and education are of the highest quality. Well, we know how bad, what dire straits our healthcare and education systems are in this country, in this province. Pensions and old age security are secured and markedly enhanced. That should give comfort to many people. Number nine, every Albertan and their family enjoy an enhanced quality of life and standard of living. Number 10, Alberta becomes the lowest taxed, hallelujah, and highest GDP per capita nation in the world. This is a wonderful vision, and we're going to find out more about it. Before we do that, we're going to welcome Michael to the show. Michael, welcome to Grey Matter.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thanks very much for being here today. Before we get into talking about the Alberta Prosperity Project and why it's happening, why it's needed, I wonder if you wouldn't mind telling people a little bit more about yourself. Obviously, we know you have a large and flourishing family. God has blessed you mightily. You've been fruitful and multiplied. But could you tell us about your family roots growing up, attending university, life in academia, why you hated it, how you became an independent researcher and a writer? So could you give us a little thumbnail sketch of your biography?
Sure. If I can just start though with where you ended there. I was never really in academia as such. Like I got my PhD. I was a sessional for one time. I applied for some positions, but just the way life circumstances were at the time, I ended up taking a job in publishing instead of continuing on in academia. So I've never really had an academic career as such. I mean, I've got my academic training, which I've tried to use in terms of writing articles and books to help people understand things that I think are important. But but I didn't really follow an academic career in that sense. And sometimes, the term independent research writer just means unemployed. Not all the time, but that's what it can mean sometimes. Anyway, excuse me. I was born in Manitoba, but we moved to Alberta when I was 4 years old. And so I've grown up here. I've been here almost all my life. First, we were in Edmonton, then we moved to Calgary, and I did most of my growing up in Calgary and most of my education in Calgary. So even though I've been in Edmonton for at least more than 25 years, I do still see Calgary kind of as my hometown, and I more cheer for the Flames. I do cheer for the Oilers too. Most of my kids are born in Edmonton, and so they're more Oilers fans. So yeah, I just did, I went from high school directly into University of Calgary. At that time, I kind of had a different attitude to life. I was doing university just to avoid getting a job, basically. So, but in my very last semester of doing my bachelor's degree, I had the most important university course of my life, and it was on North American political theory. It was taught by Ryan Arnoff, a professor there, and that course completely changed my attitude towards university. Like at that point, I wanted to get a degree so I can get a job. That was my attitude, and that particular course really opened my eyes to to the importance of certain political philosophical beliefs and things like that. And so, at that point, I'd already made decisions which got me out of university for a while, and I ended up working. To make a long story short, I ended up working for my dad in Calgary. He had a produce processing business, and I realized a career in business wasn't for me. And so I applied for graduate school in Calgary in the mid '90s, and I did an MA, and I enjoyed it so much that I applied for doing a PhD, and that's how I ended up at the University of Alberta in the late '90s doing a PhD. But my graduate school research was actually in education policy, and this kind of ties in with the homeschooling thing. Like my master's thesis ended up being called Private versus Public Education, the Alberta debate in the 1980s, because there was a huge debate in Alberta in the 1980s. Actually, in North America generally, but it hit Alberta in the 80s. By the 1970s, public schools had really started to change. Like historically, public schools had been kind of conservative in terms of their approach to teaching children and what they would teach children. It started changing in the 70s when kind of more controversial materials were brought in, and more controversial, more kind of risky, or I shouldn't say more edgy social sex education came in. And so during the 70s, we saw a dramatic increase in the number of private schools that were started. By the late 70s and early 80s, more and more parents were thinking, wait a minute, I don't agree with the values being taught in the public schools. And so with this increase in the number of private schools, the education establishment fought back. Anyway, that just kind of lead up to my MA thesis is about that dispute between parental rights activists on the one hand and the education establishment on the other. And to make a long story short, the parental rights activists came out on top in the 1988 School Act. So anyway, that was my MA thesis. Then when I did a PhD dissertation at the U of A, it was much broader. It wasn't just about private education. It was about the development of basically education policy under Peter Lougheed, because Peter Lougheed brought in a lot of positive changes in education, and he kind of had a trajectory of giving parents more rights, at least in terms of private schooling and stuff. And so when I was at the University of Alberta, it was very controversial. Ralph Klein was premier. He was bringing in educational changes, and the educational establishment was saying, well, Ralph Klein is changing our system in a way it was never changed before, like in terms of it brought in charter schools. And the charter schools, of course, were a new initiative, but they really followed the same trajectory that Peter Lougheed had said of allowing parents more options in education. So my thesis, my dissertation thesis, was much about how Ralph Klein's changes, as radical as they may have seemed, were actually continuations of policy that Peter Lougheed himself had brought in. I hope I'm not getting off track here, but
No, this is very interesting.
Okay, so my area at that time was education policy, and so I was very interested in parental rights and parents having the options for private schooling and homeschooling. Of course, we were homeschooling, and so I was a little bit involved in the homeschooling community, and my research tied in a sense with my life that way. But earlier on, like to get into the more Alberta stuff.
Before you go there, can I ask you something,
sure.
Michael?
Yeah,
because
absolutely. Yeah.
This homeschooling issue is one that's very, very topical and controversial right now, especially in the United States. I take it from listening to you, you are an advocate of homeschooling.
Absolutely.
Could you tell us why you take that position, why you think homeschooling is preferable or more beneficial than the public education system in that context? Maybe describe, what are some of the issues that are problematic in public education today?
Well, like there's one really key thing, and then a few others things. But the one really key thing is that people don't realize all education is taught from a particular philosophy or a particular worldview. Like some people might not be familiar with the term worldview, but everybody has a worldview. Everybody has a fundamental understanding of what's important in life, the meaning of life. So sometimes I use the word philosophy instead. But all education is taught from a particular philosophical perspective.
Because the Weltanschauung.
That exactly, because someone has to determine what's important. What do the children need to learn, and how should they learn it? And those are all based on the philosophical background. Now, as I mentioned, by the 70s, the philosophical background of public education had changed a lot, and a lot of more conservative parents, and I'm from a Christian background, and for me, Christianity was important. I didn't like, and my wife didn't like, the philosophy behind the public education curriculum. We wanted to be able to choose a curriculum for ourselves that was based on what we believed, on a Christian worldview, a Christian philosophical basis. So that is kind of the most fundamental decision-making aspect, that we wanted an education that would be consistent with our beliefs. We wanted our children to learn what we believed and not what a rival philosophical perspective believes. That's kind of the overriding theme in terms of the whole debate in North America between homeschooling and private education on one hand and public education on the other. Of course, there are many more things that fit in with that. There are people, especially in the home education community, who point out, though, that children learn best when they are learning what they want to learn. Like every child actually develops at a different speed, and every child has different interests. And when children are learning something that's relevant for their level of learning and that they're interested in, they learn it and they retain it because they're really interested in that.
Right.
One of the things, actually, when I look back on my own education, I was actually really bad at reading when I was a young boy. And actually, boys tend to be later in their development and learning to read. And so what happens when boys are taught to learn to read too early, or if they're expected to learn to read too early, they learn two things. Number one, learning is hard. Learning is difficult. Number two, I don't like reading. Sorry. I should have said. No, I shouldn't have said learning. I should. No, I said that wrong. The number one thing they learn is reading is hard. That's what they learn if they're being taught to learn to read too early. And reading, I don't like reading, is the other thing they learn. And that's kind of how I was. Like when I was young, I did not like reading. I didn't like books. And now I'm a writer, so things turned out properly. But when I realized that this had happened to me, I think back. This happens to so many boys. They're pushed too early. And in home education, the children aren't pushed too early. They can learn at their own speed. And so some children don't learn to read till later, but they learn when they're ready to, and then they become good readers after that. So I bring that up in the sense that, children learn individually. Like some of them learn in different methods. Some of them learn at different stages. Some of them learn at different speeds. And home education enables the parents to provide the kind of education that children need at their own level. And so that's one of the superior benefits from education generally. Now, schooling, there are some school philosophies that tie in with that as well. But generally speaking, with a public education system, you've got this big monolithic system. And I mean, there's many good people in there. Like, I'm not knocking the people that are in there, but it's actually based on the factory model. Like the public education system was developed in the 1800s in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. And it took the same basic format. You bring your input, the little kids, and they go through their various stages of the factory, and they come out and they're all supposed to have the same thing because they're given the same inputs at the same time, at the same stages, even though they're not necessarily ready. So that kind of whole way of doing education doesn't work for lots of kids, whereas home education can.
That's very fascinating for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because obviously it hits on a few points that are in the APP vision in terms of, the role of God in the state, education, freedom, but also what's revealed in there is perhaps a very intriguing explanation for why boys are doing so poorly in public education. This is something that I find I'm a father of two boys, and I find is not talked about enough, is how poorly boys are doing in relation to girls through the public school system. They're not graduating high schools often. They're dropping out more. The relationship of them going on to university is now at nearly 60-40 in North America, and yet no one's talking about this. And homeschooling, the way you described it, might be at least a part of the answer. And so that's very intriguing. Thanks for that. So Michael, that's kind of a bonus thing that we learned there. I wasn't expecting that. But let's talk a little bit more about Alberta's role in Confederation and what's wrong with it and why it has to change. Because I know recently this is taking up a lot of your time. You've been writing about it extensively and going around and talking to people. So you've told us that you're not, a 19th century Canadian historian, but obviously you're knowledgeable in that area. You're more of a 20th century, late 20th century expert. But I wonder if you wouldn't mind just giving us maybe a thumbnail sketch of a brief history of Alberta's role in Confederation, how it was doomed to fail and why.
Okay, well, like Alberta, of course, was originally part of Rupert's Land. Rupert's Land was originally owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, and Canada purchased Rupert's Land and annexed Rupert's Land to Canada without consulting the people that were here. And then there were people that were here, especially in the Red River Colony. There were people who had different ideas about what their political future should be. And so the fact that they were annexed to Canada without being consulted, that was a contributing factor in the Riel Rebellion of 1870. So, of course, the Rupert's Land was annexed to Canada, and then the Canadian government brought in settlers to create an agricultural economy, and that, of course, was a good thing. To bring in people to create farms and make this like an economically developed area in terms of agriculture. But, of course, the farmers here had certain disadvantages, and one was the federal government had specifically set up a a tariff so that the farmers had to purchase their equipment from Eastern Canada. So they had to pay more money for their equipment than they would otherwise because of this protective tariff. So they were losing on that end. Then also when they sold their wheat, they had to sell it through middlemen who took part of the price, and they also had to pay the transportation costs. So the farmers had to pay more, and they got less for their, the fruits of their labor, and so they were at these disadvantages. And they didn't just sit back and take it, though. I mean, if you read the history of the early 20th century on the prairies, there was a lot of political activity, and one of the main ways this was expressed was that the farmers turned away from mainstream parties. So, Alberta started out with a Liberal government, but in 1921, the United Farmers of Alberta was elected as a political party, and it was in power for 14 years. So you had a United Farmers of Alberta government, and that was at the provincial level. At the federal level, Alberta was electing mostly Progressive Party members of Parliament. Now, progressive, I just want to point out, means a little bit different now than it did mean then. So just in case someone's worried about that, it was a farmers' party. So it extended a little bit into Ontario too. There were Ontario farmers who were concerned, but it was mostly a Western party, and Alberta was the seat of the Progressive Party while it was around. So Albertans, it did fight back in this way, but really there was very little sentiment for independence. Like, that wasn't one of the themes that would manifest itself until Pierre Trudeau came around. But I will put in a little footnote here, and that is I think it was around 1915. A Liberal MLA in Alberta wrote a book called Canada and Its Colonies, which was sort of a separatist book. Like, I don't know if you read that, but his main concern, Alwyn, he had a Bramley Moore, I think was his name. His main concern was Alberta did not own its resources. And this is something I forgot to point out, that when the prairie provinces were formed, they were not given the ownership and control of the resources like the other provinces had. The federal government still maintained control of the ownership and control of natural resources in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba until 1930. But Bramley Moore was concerned because he saw how what a disadvantage Alberta was at because it didn't own its resources, and it needed the money. The Alberta government needed money for fulfilling its obligations, and it got a little stipend from the federal government, but it wasn't getting the money from its resources. Instead, the federal government was. So he wrote this book saying, essentially, Alberta should separate from Canada and then renegotiate entry in with ownership of its own resources. So it's kind of the first, literary manifestation of Alberta separatism. But it wasn't a movement. Like, he didn't form an organization, and there was no like mass movement or anything. It's just a manifestation of discontent. Of course, there's all, going back to the early years, there's different kinds of manifestations of discontent. But the serious sentiment for Alberta independence did not arise until Pierre Trudeau became prime minister. So it's in the late 60s when that first starts to get talked about. So there is a sense, there's lots of reasons for Westerners to be discontented with Canada throughout much of the 20th century, but there were economists who studied, the different aspects of how the Western provinces were in advantages or disadvantages, and the stuff that I read said really there was no economic basis for the West to be on its own until the late 1960s. I mean, that's, Alberta with its oil. Alberta didn't discover oil until 1947, right? So before 1947, Alberta was one of the poorest of provinces. So it would be insane to separate as a poor province, right? And even with oil being discovered in 1947, it brought in lots of money to Alberta, but the price of oil compared to today was still very, very low, even on a comparative perspective. So it wasn't the strong enough basis, to form a country. So the real economic impetus doesn't arise until the late 1960s, and especially with the energy crisis of 1973. That's when oil prices really skyrocketed, and a country could live off of oil in a sense from that point forward. So I might have got off on a rabbit trail here. Sorry. Maybe you can bring me back to where I'm supposed to.
No, never. But I'll just interject here. When before you continue, when Dr. Modry was on the program, and you've probably heard him refer to this, he has a quotation from Clifford Sifton, who basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically Clifford Sifton, who was the Minister of Immigration at the time, or the equivalent thereof, said words to the effect in 1904 that Alberta and Saskatchewan were being created for the purposes of providing financial support and resources to Canada. So part of what Dr. Modry says, and I know you've heard him say this many times, is that essentially Alberta and Saskatchewan they are born out of a relationship of exploitation, and that really has just continued on, and it sounds like what you're saying is that really has been exacerbated as Alberta has grown into, let's face it, the financial engine of Canada.
Yeah, that's right. And people like those statements from people like Clifford Sifton, they had to sell the idea of Western Canada to Eastern Canada, and Eastern Canada purchased, like as I mentioned, Rupert's Land. They had to borrow the money for that, and so they had to convince people that this was a worthwhile investment. And also, the federal government had to pay for the railway across Western Canada, and so they really had to sell this idea that Western Canada is going to benefit us. They had to sell that to their own voters in order to, to convince them that this was something that should be done. And so they wanted to make it look as advantageous to their Eastern voters as possible, right? So that kind of helps to explain why they try and sell it this way. Well, we're going to get
if only Trudeau and company tried that hard to sell the benefits of supporting Quebec to Albertans. I'm waiting for that sales job, Michael. Be a snow job, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, please continue.
Oh, sorry, where was I? I lost kind of. I was just
kind
of explaining.
You were talking about how in the 1970s Alberta sort of came into
right.
its economic maturity because of the energy crisis of the early 1970s.
Right.
Pick it up from there?
Yes. Yeah. For sure. Thank you. Trudeau did two major things at that time in the early 70s, that really hurt Alberta. Like Alberta could really cash in on the oil because Alberta owned and controlled those resources. But Trudeau wanted to make sure that his government or Central Canada would benefit. So he kept the price of oil artificially low in Canada throughout the 1970s. So when Alberta oil was sold within Canada, Alberta was not getting the full price, like it was getting considerably lower than what it ought to have. But Alberta was also exporting oil to the United States, and Trudeau did something that was quite unprecedented, and that was put an export tax on Alberta's oil. So whether Alberta sold oil within Canada, the price would be low, and sold it to the United States, you'd get the full world price. But then with this export tax, the federal government would take a huge amount of it. So Alberta couldn't win. Whether we sold the oil within Canada or out of Canada, the federal government was benefiting and Central Canada was benefiting. And Peter Lougheed, we got to give him credit. He fought strong for Alberta during those years. He did not believe that what Trudeau was doing was right. And that's why, one of the reasons, at least, Peter Lougheed won huge majorities. He first was elected in 1971, but he started fighting Trudeau in the 70s. He was reelected with a huge majority in 75 and a huge majority in 1979 because Albertans knew that he was fighting for us, against what the federal government was doing. So the progressive conservatives, in a sense, were seen as the people who were fighting for Alberta, whether at the provincial level or the federal level. And indeed, in 1979, the progressive conservative leader, Joe Clark, was elected with a minority government. So he only lasted a few years. He was from Alberta. It was expected that Alberta would finally get a good deal on its oil, although it wasn't really clear that was going to happen, but he was defeated anyway. And we ended up with the 1980 federal election. And this, this is the federal election that brought Pierre Trudeau back for his final term. But what's really distinct about this election is how divisive it was in terms of regionalism. Like Canada is a big country, and any big country with different regions, there's going to be different regional interests, and there's going to be competition between these interests. So national leaders tend to try and smooth over the differences in the interest of protecting national unity. Like you don't want the country to split apart because the different regions are fighting. So Canadian national leaders would try and smooth over those differences. But in 1980, the Liberals decided to exploit the differences and figure they could win in Central Canada if they fought against Alberta. And Keith Davey was one of the top Liberal campaign officials, and he later said their unofficial slogan was something like "Screw the West, we'll take the rest." And that's exactly what they did. They told voters in Central Canada, vote for us, and we're going to take care of those Albertans, and you'll get better oil prices. And so Trudeau was elected on that platform. And so it's not a surprise when he brought in the National Energy Program, which was fulfillment of his promises for the federal government to, seize more control of Alberta's oil and make it more beneficial for Central Canada. Wow. And the National Energy Program did more than anything in history to bolster an Alberta separatist movement. And like I've said in some of these meetings and in my books that Pierre Trudeau is the father of the Alberta independence movement. Like people didn't really take it seriously until Pierre Trudeau came along, and especially after he was reelected in 1980, and then really especially after the National Energy Program was brought in. And I'll just throw this in too, that, when you look at polling in support for Western independence or Alberta independence, and the polling started probably in late 60s, because that's when people started talking about it. Until 1980, the polls in almost every case show single-digit support, like even as low as 4 or 5% support for independence. From 1980 onwards, it's always double-digit support, and the lowest ones I think I've seen have been like 15 or 16%, and that was back in those days. Like now, it's common if they take a a poll on support for independence or separation in Alberta, it's commonly 20 or 25% or more. Like they don't even, even if it comes out at 20%, they say, well, that's low, low support. There's not much support for independence. Well, you compare that to a few years ago, that's not so low like it used to be. And I think they should be concerned if it's that high all the time. They can tell people it's low, but I don't know. I don't think that's low. That's kind of like the basement, and it can only go up from there. So, so Pierre,
Mike,
sorry.
So for those who don't know, Michael, could you just explain a little bit about what the National Energy Program was about and why it was so harmful to Alberta?
Sure. Of course, the oil prices was a huge issue in the late 70s and early 80s. It was the energy crisis, and it was harming economies. The oil price had gone up so quickly, and of course, oil and energy is essential to any economy. So the rapid rise in the cost of energy was harming businesses and causing recessions. So it was very important for the governments to encourage the development, the exploration and development of oil, but the Trudeau Liberals were, had a socialistic bent, and they were concerned because a lot of Alberta's a lot of the oil companies here that were developing oil were American. They were owned by the United States. That's the Americans should take credit for that, because when Alberta discovered oil, it was the Americans who came and developed it. People in the East weren't quite as interested. The Americans had the expertise because, of course, they had oil in the West already. They had the expertise. They were willing to do it. They came in here, and they ended up, controlling much of the industry before the prices went up. So, they were certainly doing well when the prices went up, but they were here, because they were the ones who wanted to do it. But then the Liberals see this, this is, they see this in a sinister kind of way, and they were looking at it from a Canadian left-wing nationalist perspective, and they wanted to get the Americans out to some degree. So part of the National Energy Program was to, what they called Canadianize the industry, to kind of push those American companies out and have the federal government and maybe some Canadian investors take more control. And also they wanted to have more Canadian exploration in the north, actually, because there was, substantial oil resources there. So it was basically, to have Canada's energy policy determined by the federal government more than the free market, and it would also, entail keeping prices lower for companies and for companies actually not getting the full fruits of their rewards for the efforts that they put in. So as soon as the program came in, it was very famous at the time. I don't know if you remember, if you're old enough to remember, but on TV they'd show the rigs, heading south to the United States, because why drill for oil in Alberta and discover oil only for the federal government to be the one that's going to benefit from it? So the industry, I wouldn't say it collapsed, but it certainly declined rapidly. And that was the basis of Alberta's economy. So immediately, there were all kinds of economic problems in Alberta. And I've even talked to people at some of these meetings who remember whose parents lost their homes or their jobs or something because of the economic decline that resulted from the National Energy Program. Now, a lot of people want to blame a recession that happened across Canada in the early 1980s, and that was a contributing factor, but it wasn't. It was just one. Like, the National Energy Program certainly had its own contribution to those hard times that Albertans experienced. And there's economists who have studied that and shown that Alberta was hit hard by the National Energy Program, in addition to the recession that hit the whole country. So I just want to make that point, because some people say, well, you're blaming the National Energy Program for something that was a countrywide recession. Say, no, there were both factors were there, but the National Energy Program definitely hurt Alberta.
But your key point is that the National Energy Program really stoked the fires of separatism in Alberta.
Yeah, absolutely. That's when, the first major organizations, the first mass organizations were formed actually after Trudeau was elected in February 1980. I think it was the end of February 1980. The anger of him being reelected after the divisive campaign that he had run, that started getting organizations going. And there were meetings of some with a few hundred people even then, before the National Energy Program. But once the National Energy Program was brought in, there were meetings of over 1,000 or 2,000 people or more. There's one really famous one at the Edmonton Jubilee Auditorium. And I'm quite sure it was somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people. And I think Douglas Christie, who was from BC and the founder of the Western Canada Concept, I think he debated Nick Taylor, the leader of the Alberta Liberal Party. And of course, the audience favored Doug Christie, but I got to give credit for Nick Taylor. He was a brave man. I mean, I don't agree with the side he was on. He was actually an oil man who was supporting the Liberal Party, but he was brave to go into a den like that and stand up for what he believed in. But I mean, there was a mass movement then, and of course, the Western Canada Concept, it ended up forming an Alberta provincial party, the Western Canada Concept Party of Alberta, and there was some kind of conflict there with Doug Christie, and he ended up being out of the Alberta arm of it. Like he kept an organization called the Western Canada Concept in BC, and later would travel across the West with that. But the Alberta Western Canada Concept was an organization separate from him, and it ran a candidate in a by-election in 1982 in the old Didsbury constituency. I think that was February 1982, and they won that by-election. And that was the first time Western separatists had been elected in Western Canada, unless you count the Real Rebellion or something. But yeah. Really, it was national news. It had a national impact. It was a very significant event. And Western Canada Concept after that, that by-election drew a lot of members, and the party started growing very, very quickly after that, and started organizing around the province. But the thing that there were two things that kind of brought it down, and one was internal division. The people within the party were fighting among themselves even as it was growing. So that kind of discredited it to some degree. And then also, Peter Lougheed decided to hold an early provincial election. Like he'd been reelected in 1979. He didn't have to have an election until 1983. But I think it was partly because at least they saw the rapid rise of the Western Canada Concept. They decided to have an election toward the end of 1982, and it was wise on their part because of the infighting in the Western Canada Concept. None of their guys were elected, and they actually lost that one seat. But they did get almost 12% of the provincial vote. I mean, like in rural areas, they were very strong. They came second in many, many ridings in rural areas, and so they were still a strong force. But if they hadn't had so much internal dissension, which would get into the news, of course, and be played up, they really very well could have elected some MLAs at that time. Mm-hmm. But of course, Peter Lougheed too, like he did stand up for Alberta to a large degree. So it wasn't like he was a pushover or like a federalist. Well, he was a federalist, but he wasn't here to push like a Trudeau agenda in any respect. He would fight Trudeau.
Right. So pick that up then in the early to mid 80s. What was the state of the separatist movement at that time in the aftermath of the WCC?
Like the WCC, it still existed, but it really just as a shell of itself after the 1982 election. But what happened really significantly, though, was, as I mentioned, many Albertans looked to the Progressive Conservative Party as the party that would save us. And in 1984. Of course, Brian Mulroney was elected as the Progressive Conservative Prime Minister, and all of Alberta's members of Parliament were with the Progressive Conservative Party. So it looked like we were in government, and we got rid of the Liberals. Trudeau had been in power, for the most part since 1968. We finally got rid of him with Brian Mulroney being in power, and our MPs were in the government. Things were going to be okay for us. So it looked, at least that's the way it looked. And so separatism really died out. The WCC was just a very small organization then, and it remained that way until Brian Mulroney, didn't enact policies as favorable to the West as some people expected. And then, to make a long story short, in 1986, there was a competition as to which company would have the CF-18 fighter maintenance contract. Canada had just purchased the CF-18 fighters, and it was a very expensive contract to maintain them. And there were two companies that could do that within Canada. One was based in Winnipeg, and one was based in Montreal. And the Winnipeg company actually won the competition by the government's criteria. So the Winnipeg company should have got the CF-18 maintenance contract, but Brian Mulroney instead decided to award that contract to Montreal, even though Winnipeg had won the contract, by the government's own criteria. And this showed Westerners once again, that the dominance of Central Canada to the country's politics. Like Mulroney was from Quebec, and much of his caucus was from Quebec, even though there were a lot of Alberta MPs. And this was just a betrayal. Alberta had supported the Progressive Conservatives, for years and years and years, through all the times fighting with Trudeau, and the Progressive Conservatives were the guys who were going to fight for us. And here they finally get a chance to do something for us, and they give it to Montreal. So there was a real sense of betrayal, and that sense of betrayal was probably more than anything what led to the rise of the Reform Party then in 1987. Because people across the West, of course, it was an affront mostly to Manitoba officially, but people in the West, and especially on the prairies, felt this as an affront to all of us. Mm-hmm. And so Preston Manning, of course, had been in the background all this time, and he had been, watching events, and he thought, well, now was the time to create a party for the West that would represent the West's interests. And of course, Ted Byfield from Alberta Report was a major player in those early years, helping to promote that movement and working with Preston Manning to get those ideas out. And they held, an assembly and ended up forming that political party. And they won in the 1988 federal election. They came second in a number of Alberta ridings, but they didn't win any seats. But the 1988 federal election, what was crucial about that was called the free trade election, because Brian Mulroney was campaigning on the free trade agreement, and people in the West had wanted free trade for generations. And so there were a lot of people who were very sympathetic to Reform Party, but they voted for the Progressive Conservatives because they wanted to ensure that there was going to be that free trade agreement would get in, because that would really benefit Alberta. And there were even some people who thought that the free trade agreement would prevent the federal government from ever being able to enact a national energy program type of policy again. Anyway, it was the free trade program that initiative was seen as very important to the West. And so a lot of Westerners voted Progressive Conservative who otherwise would have voted Reform, just because it was so important to get that free trade agreement in for the West. So then the Reform Party, they elected a person in a by-election, Deborah Grey, in 1989. Like shortly after that 1988 federal election, one of the Conservative MPs tragically passed away. So there was a by-election. He was from Alberta, and Deborah Grey was elected with a massive amount of votes. And so she was sent as the first Reform Party member of Parliament to Ottawa, and she did well representing the party. And actually, now that I think of it too, also there was a Senate election campaign. Alberta had decided. It was Premier Don Getty had decided to allow Senate elections in Alberta, something quite unique. So there was a Senate election, I believe it was 1989 as well. And the Reform Party ran a candidate who won, Stan Waters. General Stan Waters. He was a retired Canadian Army general. So he won that Senate election for Alberta. And of course, he wasn't immediately appointed because the Brian Mulroney's government didn't like him. But to make a long story short, he was ultimately appointed to the Senate, Stan Waters. But unfortunately, he passed away as relative. Well, he wasn't a young man, but relatively young by today's standards. Still, that was quite historic that we'd have somebody who was elected appointed to the Senate. And so that was kind of a groundbreaking thing. And it actually looked at the time like Senate reform was something that was going to happen, maybe because we elected this guy and he got appointed, but that all fell apart. Anyway, I hope I'm not droning on here too long, but
no. Just one point I wanted to raise about Preston Manning and the Reform Party. I heard Mr. Manning speak recently in Calgary, and he was describing how the Reform Party got going, and much like the APP, it was not a political party in the beginning. It was more almost like a think tank. He describes a scenario in which he contacted Prime Minister Mulroney at the time and said, there's really something going on in Alberta out here, and you should really send some of your MPs out here to talk to us because something's happening here. And not only did Mulroney say, no, we're not going to get involved with you in any of that, but he prohibited any member of his caucus or his party to go out there and even talk to anybody from the reform. And so it's sort of a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that ultimately, as you know, within a very short space of years, the old Progressive Conservative Party was in tatters, and the Reform Party was the official opposition in Parliament. And actually, in the beginning, Mr. Manning and the others who started it we really didn't have any clear idea they were even going to start a political party. They formed a political party almost out of necessity. But I just mentioned that because it shows the extent of the Western alienation that you're kind of talking about.
Yeah, it was first the Reform Association, and there were people who had different potential paths that they could take. So when they held their assembly, it was like, should we infiltrate one of the other parties, or should we just remain as a non-party organization, or should we, form our own party? And ultimately they did form their own party, like you said, because one of the possibilities was just for their people just to get more involved in the Progressive Conservatives and represent themselves that way. And there were people who favored that party because they thought that a new party would just become a fringe party, that it would become kind of like a WCC party where it might have a little bit of traction and then fall apart in internal fighting and things like that. So there were reasonable reasons why some people didn't think a party was the route to go, but ultimately there was a majority that believed the party was the route to go, and they were quite successful. Ultimately in the 1993 federal election, they took most of Alberta's seats and probably most of Saskatchewan's, but they took lots on the prairies and even in BC, and they were just a couple of seats behind the Bloc Québécois. So in that first, from 1993 to 1997, the Bloc Québécois was official opposition, but then in the 1997 election, Reform picked up more seats and became the official opposition. But they really were the party of the West. I mean, they tried to go more national, but their voting base was always in the West, and especially Alberta. Alberta was there.
And do you see that success as a kind of an expression of Western alienation and frustration with Confederation, the success of the Reform Party in that period?
Yeah, I think so, because very much, the Reform Party's slogan, at least in the early years, was "The West wants in." Yeah. This was the chance because Preston Manning, I'm quite sure it's in his book called A New Canada, with his first book, where he talked about how, he saw there was a rising support for separatism after the CF-18 decision from Brian Mulroney, but he wanted to redirect that kind of energy. He figured he could redirect it into a way of making Canada stronger. Like if the West could truly be represented in Canada's national institutions, Canada could be stronger and better. And so he saw that was kind of the Reform Party's idea. Like, let's get the West really represented in national institutions. Then the national institutions really represent the entire country, and we're a stronger country that way. And that's a good argument, and that could have worked. And I think, like, I don't like to say the Reform Party failed. I don't think the Reform Party failed. I think Canada failed, because I think the Reform Party, went in there with lots of support from the West, lots of support from Alberta, and so a lot of good ideas. And they were good people. These were not wacko people. These were our best people. If Central Canada would have listened, things could have been improved. But it was a failure of Central Canada. They didn't want to hear what these Westerners had to say. They have their own version of what Canada is, and then they like it the way it is, and they weren't going to make any of these reforms. So the Reform Party, I think, was our best chance of getting reform within Canada. And so I say at these meetings, I say, if Preston Manning and the Reform Party, if they can't get changes that improve Alberta's position within Canada, then nobody can. Like, we can't even, like, think of the logistical and other problems of trying to get a party that big and that strong again. Like, it's just, they did so much, you know what I mean? All the people, all the hours, all the work, all the money that would have to go into building something like that. It doesn't look like it's going to happen. I mean, and we've already tried it. We've tried it, and they did not want us. Like I say, the party did not fail. The Reform Party did not fail. Canada failed. But it shows us that that's not the way forward. The way forward is out.
That's interesting. And, I know you talk about this, and perhaps you could comment about it. Even when we got a prime minister from Calgary, Mr. Harper, things really did not improve, did they?
Yeah, like, the way I put it is, when the Conservatives are in power, it's better for Alberta. We do get better policies for Alberta when the Conservatives are in power. Alberta got better policies from the federal government because Stephen Harper was there. Like, I don't want to discredit him in that way, but the Conservative Party and even Stephen Harper cannot fix the country. They cannot fix the fundamental structures that caused the trouble that the West experiences. Like, even Stephen Harper and his government, they still had to make sure that their policies, were well accepted in Ontario and Quebec. And they weren't going to adopt policies that would be opposed by Ontario and Quebec. And that's not their fault. I mean, that's just the way the system is. And so even the person with the best intentions with the Conservative Party can only do so much. And, like, they can give a reprieve to the West. So, like, if the Conservatives were elected, say, next year or something like that, it would bring a reprieve to Alberta. We would get better policies. We might get some pipelines through. But then it's only temporary, because eventually they'll be replaced by the Liberals again, and we'll get back to the exact same cycle.
Right.
As long as we're in Canada, we're going to get that same cycle over and over again, in spite of how good the Conservatives do for us when they are in power.
So we've had the two Trudeaus, and when I was a kid, this is a bit of a metaphor. When I was a kid, there was a very scary movie. It was called Jaws. And it was so scary that little kids like me were afraid to submerge our heads in the bathtub because we thought the shark would get us. But, after a little while, after a year or so, maybe more, we thought, what, it's okay. We can go back in the water now. But then they came out with the second Jaws movie. And the slogan for the second Jaws movie was, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. And so applying this to the West, just when you thought it was safe to vote Liberal, along comes the second Trudeau, and he got his razor sharp carcharodon teeth out, and tell us how that went. There's a little setup for you, Michael.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, of course, when Justin Trudeau, was elected in 2015 with an agenda to deal with climate change, they did get some votes in Alberta in 2015, because I don't think he made as clear beforehand the kinds of policies he was going to implement. But of course, he did bring in, the Alberta tanker ban was one of the laws he brought in. I can't remember the bill name. Might have been Bill C-48 or something like that. That was to prevent any Alberta oil from being exported off of BC's coast. Now, this is significant because, Alberta has been dependent on the United States as our export market. And there's a real desire to diversify our export markets because, our price of oil to the United States is often discounted because it's our only market. They kind of have a monopoly on us. And sometimes we're selling oil to them cheaper than we ought to otherwise. So there's the idea we need to diversify. And if we could get our oil, to the West Coast and ship it in tankers off the West Coast, we could sell it to more markets and get a better price. So that makes sense as to what Alberta should do and what would be good, not just for Alberta, but for Canada. But Justin Trudeau brought in that tanker ban so that Alberta could not export its oil that way. And he also brought in the No More Pipelines bill. That might have been Bill C-69 or something like that. Yeah, the Impact Assessment Act. Now, of course, the Alberta Court of Appeal recently said it's unconstitutional, but that their ruling has no effect for now, and it's going to be up to the Supreme Court, which is most likely to rule in favor of the federal government. But of course, that has made it so much more difficult for pipelines to be built. So that's why people call it the No More Pipelines bill. Maybe it is. Maybe there won't be pipelines built after that. But there's these kind of policies. Also, the carbon tax. All these policies, the impact of them is to subvert Alberta's ownership and control of resources, because it's great that we own and control our resources, but if we can't develop them and export them, then what's the point of owning them in the first place? So it's these indirect, these policies are indirectly subverting what the Constitution allows us to do, and it's for these reasons, that so many Albertans got angry. And in 2019, when Trudeau was reelected, that's when we really saw the rise of the Wexit movement. I mean, the Wexit had started a few weeks earlier in anticipation of the election, but they're big meetings with hundreds of people, and even over 1,000 in Calgary in the wake of that 2019 election. Again, it's kind of like 1980. You get an election of a Trudeau who's anti-Alberta, and you get the people coming out to big meetings. But if I could just draw a distinction, though, those are people coming out to meetings. They're very concerned people, but they're angry by what happened. What's different between the big turnout in those meetings and the big turnout at the APP meetings right now is it's not that people are like, it's not like something just happened and we're angry and we're going to these meetings in hundreds. Like, the people coming out now are people who are thinking, what are we going to do to solve our problems? So it's not just an anger reaction like we saw with some of the meetings in the past. These are people who are thoughtful about the future, and they want a solution, and they're coming out in big numbers. And I was surprised when I first started coming to these meetings. Like, look at all these people, and they're really interested, and they're really good people. You know what I mean? It's and so there's something deep down among many Albertans that have them looking to the future and looking for real solutions. And so I was really excited when about the APP when I heard about it and saw what was going on.
I'm very glad that you mentioned that, because what you just described is quite consistent with my own experience. I attended my first APP meeting recently in Airdrie, and frankly, I went there expecting sort of angry, fed up, frustrated people, and what I experienced was something very, very different. It was like a church revival. Everyone was very friendly, welcoming, smiling. People I didn't know recognized me from the podcast, and ladies hugged me, which is always nice. And one lady even asked to take a selfie with me, which was a new experience and rather strange. But I agree with you. What I found was it was just overwhelmingly positive, and even the speakers, even like yourself. I mean, you talk about the problems with Confederation and why it's bad for Alberta, but you also talk about solutions. And I think that's what maybe is different between what was happening when I was a kid and a teenager in the 80s, and my dad would not allow us to speak the first Trudeau's name at the dinner table, and today, where where people like you are saying, you know what, this is bad, it's wrong, we know it's wrong, but you know what, we can do something about it. And I think this is really the power of the Alberta Prosperity movement. Is it has this positive energy. It's boots on the ground. We have good ideas, but you know what? We can put boots on the ground. We can do something, and we can affect change if we make the right decisions, and we do them now. Now is the time, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Now is the time.
Yeah.
I like the way you described that. I mean, that's exactly right. And also another thing that I like about the APP, and this is kind of a side thing, but for many years I've talked to people people who are interested in independence, that we needed an organization that was not a party. We needed an organization that just gets information to people, like the holds meeting. Because if it's just a party, you'll have people who won't attend it because, well, that's that party and I'm not part of that party. You know what I mean? But if you have an organization that's not a party and its only purpose is to give information, that's a completely different level. And that's what we need to inform Albertans, so they don't feel like they're betraying their party or something by coming to this meeting. It's not a political party. It's an educational organization, and you can get really good information and meet really good people. And so that's when I first heard about the APP. That's one of the things I was excited about. And I said to my wife, finally, someone's doing it this way. Dr. Modry, he really knows what he's doing. I really admire him. And so many people in that organization are such good people.
So that's the reason. That was one of my questions for you, is, why you decided to become involved in it. And it sounds like obviously it's educational, which is right in your wheelhouse. We've said there's an inspirational aspect to it, but more than that, it's motivational. it gets people excited about doing something. It has a positive energy to it, and it sounds like that's what you see, And I think the other part of it that's really important, and I think it's a really brilliant not to form it as a political party, is its grassroots. It gets out, and you folks are getting out in the communities, and you're really talking to people, and it's folksy. Which is not to say that the people there are hicks and hillbillies and rednecks. I can tell you the people I met there are very aware of what's going on. Some very astute minds in that room. The people I met, and of course some very astute minds at the organizational level of the APP. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I think many people would ask, is okay, we're going to separate, and you've written a couple of books that we're going to talk about here, Separatism Then and Now, which you talked a little bit about, and also your most recent book, No Other Option. So I want you to tell me two things. Number one, why do you think there's no other option? And secondly, what would this separatism look like in terms of how it's going to unfold?
Cool. Firstly, in the short thing would be like, why do I think there's no other option? Because I think we've tried everything else that's reasonable. Like there have been proposals and people working on things over the years. I mean, the first book on Alberta independence was written in 1971, during the time of Pierre Trudeau's first term. And it was a collection of essays. The editors were significant people. One was the executive assistant to the Minister of Alberta, the executive assistant to Alberta's Minister of Education, and the other was executive assistant to Alberta's Premier. Now, most of those articles in the book were not favorable to independence, but the guy who was executive assistant to the Minister of Education, John Barr, he wrote saying, well, you know what we should do? We should try and fix Canada so that it's beneficial to the West. And if we can't do that, then we're just going to have to form our own country in this part of North America. So that's going back to 1971. So you have influential people, 50 years ago or more already talking about that. And, during the 1970s, there was lots of constitutional negotiations leading up to 1982, and I'm sure that the Alberta government had, ideas about how to make things better for Alberta. And then in 1981, Senator Ernest Manning, who had been Premier Ernest Manning, Alberta's longest-serving premier, he and a couple other prestigious individuals wrote a book on regional alienation, about how Canada needed to reform its national institutions to represent the West. Otherwise, the Western separatism was going to take off and become stronger. So there, again, that's 40 years ago or more, saying we need to reform Canada's national institutions to represent the West. And then the Reform Party came up, and that was their idea. And also a Conservative Party MP who was in Mulroney's government, David Kilgore from Edmonton, he wrote a book called Uneasy Patriots, explains Western alienation, the reasons for it, and how unfair it is to the West, how things are, and he concludes by saying the time is now to fix these injustices. And that was 1988. So we've got people and movements. And of course, there was the Canadian Committee for a Tripoli Senate during the 1980s, an organization formed specifically to advocate for Tripoli Senate. And of course, the Reform Party, that was part of their main agenda, was to get a Tripoli Senate. So you've got people and organizations with real good ideas, ways of improving things for the West going on year after year after year. And as far as I'm concerned, we tried it all. I mean, there are people with different proposals here and there now, but I mean, after 50 years, to me, it seems we've tried hard enough. And I don't think we're going to get a different result or a better result with some of these new ideas. With all due respect to the people who proposed them, like I don't doubt the sincerity of these people who are trying to make Alberta's situation better within Canada. I don't doubt their sincerity at all. But my level of frustration has already been passed. Like I've crossed the threshold. I think when I look back at history, I think we've tried enough, and I don't see any prospect for things getting better with any of the proposals that I've seen, despite how good they may be. I just don't realistically see anything, any other way except for, Alberta getting out. And if I just throw, I was talking to a really smart guy the other day, like he was a young guy. He hadn't experienced some of the stuff. Like, I went through, the late 70s and early 80s and the Reform Party and stuff. He was saying, oh, we still need to try a few more things. And I realized, it seemed to me that one of the reasons he thought that is he hadn't gone through the stuff that I'd gone through, if you know what I mean. Like, so he didn't have that historical perspective. Nothing against him. He's a smart guy, a bright guy. He did lots of reading. He knew a lot of stuff. He had really good ideas. But if you haven't, for someone who's younger and who hasn't lived through some of the problems we've had in the West, I could understand why they would think there's still more that we can do, because they haven't seen the previous stuff.
Yeah.
So
the rest of us have lived through a very long and bad marriage.
exactly. And so, I've had enough. Like I say, I might throw in too. I was going to mention this earlier, but when I was quite young, like even in later elementary school, I was already interested a little bit in politics, and some of my friends were too. But we were interested in like international politics. Back in those days, it was the Cold War, the big international stuff.
Right.
And so with the National Energy Program, that was the first time I got really interested in domestic politics, and I got involved in the separatist movement. I was just a teenager, I didn't know anything. I was naive and whatever, but I joined the West Fed in 1981, and after Gordon Kessler won that by-election for the WCC in 1982, I joined the Alberta WCC. I was just a feisty young idealist, right, a teenager, but it really seared itself into me. And I did in the 90s, like everybody else, I lost interest in the idea of separatism. Like people, we all looked to the Reform Party as a representation. So I wasn't involved in those days, but it doesn't take much to bring me back. When I wrote my first book, Alberta Separatism, and now I write in there how, at the time of writing this book, I'm not a separatist, but I said, you don't know what the future might hold, and we might have to go that route again, kind of thing. Because the book came out in 2009, Stephen Harper was prime minister, and people just weren't really interested. In fact, they were so uninterested that the book didn't sell at that time, and the publisher pulled it because nobody was even interested in a book on the history of it. So
I'll bet it's selling better now.
It sure is. Well, I talked to the publisher. You know what? This is something I got to give credit to Justin Trudeau, because I contacted the publisher during the 2015 election. I said, if Justin Trudeau wins, this book is going to be of interest to some people. And so when he did win, he brought the book back. And so it's been, even then, initially there wasn't a lot of interest, but there's been a lot more interest, especially since 2019.
Well, we found one redeeming quality he has.
That's right. For me,
I have to give him that.
It's helped my career a little bit. So.
Yeah, and he's certainly been, and he certainly is helping to fuel the cause of the APP.
Absolutely. Right? Yep.
One of the things that really concerns me, Michael, about the state of politics in Canada today, and why I'm a supporter of the APP, is and speaking frankly, is as a person who's a Christian, I was raised in a Lutheran home, and our charter, and I talked with Brian Peckford about this when he was on the show, and he was just brilliant. He's just such a wonderful man and a very engaging speaker and a wildly interesting intellect. Anyway, we were talking about the charter, and he had worked on the original charter and actually written some of the provisions. He talked about the preamble to the charter, and this is only 1982, 40 years ago. And as you know, in the charter, it states that everything that's in Canadian law is supposed to be subject to the supremacy of God, which is, of course, part of the APP vision, and the rule of law. And, as a lawyer, it's my view that the rule of law really has no meaning unless it's in the context of the supremacy of God. The rule of law really has no operative effect. It's just and this is why you hear obviously atheistic politicians like Mr. Trudeau talking about the rule of law all the time, but he never talks about God. And part of the reason why I think it's time for Alberta to leave, and why I support that, is because Canada, at least our federal government, is in its policies and even in the way that it speaks, the languages that it speaks, is not only atheistic but anti-Christian. And this is one of the most persuasive things about the APP, is as I see it as a restoration, a revival, if you will, of a renovation of what Canada was intended to be constitutionally, legally. And this connection between the morality of law and the law itself, in terms of just being the command of the sovereign, having those two connected is really vitally important in the West, as you know. And when you take one away from the other, what you have, unfortunately, is what we're experiencing right now, and that is really a government that is insensitive to what's going on with its citizens and unbeholden to them, that sees itself as a master of the electorate as opposed to a servant. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, absolutely. What you say sounds so good to me. I actually, one of my books is a critique of the charter, and much of it is actually along the lines of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know that the phrase "the supremacy of God." Trudeau personally didn't want that in there originally, but he was convinced to put that in because you know you got to remember in the early '80s when they're writing the charter and trying to get these constitutional provisions changed. Trudeau's in competition is fighting the premiers. And one of the avenues that one of the levers he had was popular opinion, because it's easy to sell people on the idea, let's write your rights right into the Constitution so the government can't violate them. And that's an easy sell. And so that was a popular idea, even though there was much more to it than that. But that's how it was sold. You know,
Hmm.
let's give your rights, let's put them in the Constitution so the government can't violate them. But in order to get the charter, Trudeau wanted to yeah, well, the charter idea was very popular. In order to maintain its popularity, like one of his MPs actually said to him, you know, if you put the supremacy of God in there, you'll get more popular support for the idea of the charter itself, because it'll appeal
Uh,
to conservative-minded people, right? Because it was the conservative-minded people who had the most resistance to the idea of a charter. But by putting the supremacy of God in there, it's basically a political sop, you know, to
right.
get more support for the charter. So he didn't really want it in there to begin with. But I think, and in my book argues, that the charter itself was fundamentally the purpose of it was to change Canada's worldview, or the philosophical basis of Canada. Like Canada,
Interesting.
in a general sense, Canada was founded on Christian principles because Britain is formerly a Christian country, and the French, when they formed Quebec, that they were officially a Christian country. So the background to Canada is like not explicitly formally Christian establishment, but the laws and the policies and the common law and all that's all based on the Christian worldview. And I believe, and I argue in my book, that Trudeau wanted to change Canada. I mean, Pierre Trudeau didn't like Canada the way it was, and that's why he wanted to make these changes. I mean, changing the Constitution fundamentally, you can't like the Constitution if you want to add fundamental changes to it, like a Charter of Rights. And I mean,
Right.
I'm getting off track here, but if you look through, like during the '70s when they were having these debates over the Constitution proposals, like Trudeau first brought in the proposal for the Charter of Rights when he was Justice Minister, and his proposal was published as a book by the Department of Justice, and you can read that and see what his ideas were. And they were debated for years afterwards. And there were many experts, political scientists and legal experts, who say, this will fundamentally transform Canada's political system if we adopt this. And that's why they were opposed to it, because of the fundamental transformation. And Sterling Lyon, the Premier of Manitoba in the late '70s and early '80s, he had the same argument. He said, our system has been working fine. We don't need a change. Don't fix what's not broken. So and I mean, we forget now, but there was lots of resistance to the charter, and there were specific reasons why people were resisting the charter. And I think the reasons were good reasons. And I guess I'm getting off track here again a bit, but
No, you're not. You're right on track. Right on track.
I really agree with what you're saying. And I'm the only person I know who still opposes the charter, and I try and promote the view a bit. But because people for so many decades, ever since it's been in, we've been taught that the charter, that's the basis of our rights. The charter gives us our rights. No, we had rights before the charter, and our rights were very well protected before the charter. And there is a good argument, like the Americans have the written Bill of Rights, and Canada had the unwritten Bill of Rights. People would say, well, the American system is better because it's written, and at an abstract level, that's right. I mean, it makes sense. But if you look at the American history, they did not protect the rights any better than Canada did. We did not have slavery the way they had slavery. We did not have Jim Crow laws that discriminated against groups of people. So you can still have a Bill of Rights and still have human rights violations. So the fact that you have a written Bill of Rights does not guarantee it's going to be better. And so our system before the charter was at least as good as the American system, and we didn't need that. We could have stuck with what we had. Anyway, again, I'm getting off track, but I think we would have been.
And the Soviet Union had a Bill of Rights too, didn't they?
Exactly. One of the Manitoba politicians made that exact statement,
Yeah.
that the Soviet Union had a written statement of rights, and it didn't guarantee anything for those people. I mean, my fundamental thesis and the charter thing and the separatism thing kind of fit together in this. In my view, is Pierre Trudeau ruined the country. I think that if you look back at Canada before Pierre Trudeau, there's so many good things about Canada. There's so much to be proud of about Canada. And I think that Pierre Trudeau was a turning point. And like whether it's the Constitution or relations with Western Canada and other things, I really think Pierre Trudeau was the one who ruined it for us. And it's certainly, that's the way I look at it anyway.
Well, using my analogy of the two sharks, let's say Trudeau was the first one, and then the second one's come to finish the job. So at least to finish off Canada, certainly not Alberta. So I want to come back to this idea of how the separatism would work. Now, my understanding is, okay, the APP is not a political party. They're not really a lobby group. They're a grassroots movement. And Dr. Modry talks about leverage. So leverage is the ability to influence elections, right, through support. And then there would be a referendum. Is that right? Could you just kind of describe how that process would unfold?
Yeah, well, in order to have a referendum, the legislature must vote for a referendum to be held in Alberta. So you have to have people elected who will, enact that referendum or hold that referendum, so that it wouldn't have to be any particular political party. I mean, theoretically, the UCP, even if they didn't support the idea of independence, they could hold a referendum if they wanted, just to see how people would vote.
And Michael, I heard you explain that the Quebec referenda kind of set the stage, set the table for Alberta in this respect, right?
Yeah, because of especially the referendum in 1995 was barely defeated. Like, Quebec came very close to voting in favor of independence, and because of that, the federal government sent a reference case to the Supreme Court. That is, the federal government asked the Supreme Court for a ruling on Canada's constitutional law with respect to provinces seceding, and the question was, could Quebec unilaterally secede from Canada? And the court ruled in the secession reference case of 1998, no, Quebec cannot unilaterally secede from Canada. However, if Quebec held a referendum on independence with a clear question and a clear majority voted in favor of independence, then the federal government would be obligated to negotiate with Quebec over Quebec's independence. So it can't unilaterally separate, but it can under certain conditions. And of course, that sets the stage for constitutional law for all the provinces. So Alberta can hold a referendum on independence as long as there's a clear question and a clear majority of people vote in favor of it. Then the federal government has to negotiate, and that's part of, like, that certainly plays into the term leverage that Dr. Modry talks about, because if Alberta had a successful referendum and the federal government has to come talk to us, we've got all the cards in the deck. And so,
we're not talking about 10 years down the line. We're talking about, APP is talking about like 2023, right?
Yeah. Well, APP is anticipating, hoping for the election of a party in 2023 that will hold the referendum. I mean, like I said, any party could hold the referendum, even if they didn't necessarily support the outcome, but probably it'd be a party that was looking for a favorable outcome that would hold the referendum. Because if a party was opposed to the successful referendum, or opposed to the potential outcome, they probably wouldn't hold it because it wouldn't be in their interest. But theoretically, they could.
We know one party that will not hold the referendum, and they shall remain nameless on this show. that name, which shall be unspoken.
Yeah.
So in the aftermath of the referendum, then there's a period of negotiation, right?
Yes.
Could you describe that a little bit, how that would unfold?
It can't be completely clear about this. There is a certain ambiguity at this point, but what the Alberta government would have a mandate to create an independent country. So Alberta would have this official constitutional mandate to create its own country, and it would begin negotiating with the federal government over what that would look like. Now, it's theoretically possible that the federal government would suddenly see the light of needing to reform Canada in the interest of protecting national unity. So, from my perspective, I would hope that the result of the successful referendum would lead to Alberta becoming independent. But theoretically, let's say the federal government had some offers for Alberta before independence, that it's theoretically possible that they could win enough support for some kind of other arrangement. But still, the key thing would be the leverage. Alberta would have the leverage, and Alberta would be in the driver's seat. So it'd be up to Albertans to decide, which one of those they'd want to choose. One of the good ideas, though, that there's a professor emeritus at the University of Alberta, Leighton Craig. He wrote an article a few years ago with something that's very interesting and very important. He suggested that the Alberta government set up a Ministry of Independence Preparation, because whenever questions of independence come up, we have all these kind of detailed questions. What about trade? What about international relations? What about money? All these kind of things. Well, if the Alberta government could set up a specific department with a minister in charge of thinking through all those issues and dealing with all those issues, so it's not left up to volunteers or activists to try and think it through. We could have people professionally employed by the government to work these things out. And I think that's so important, because it's not like we're going to have a successful referendum and then there's going to be chaos. It can be done orderly and properly. We can have the best people involved. All the things can be done legally and peacefully. This is what's so important and I think so inviting about the secession reference decision. It's a peaceful way. Like there does not have to be any way, there does not have to be conflict. I mean, I think, and Tanner Naday mentions this in some of the meetings, just because we have a successful referendum on independence, it doesn't mean we're automatically in conflict with Canada. We can remain friends. It's actually in Canada's best interest to be friendly with us and to do what's best for us. Like having trade across Alberta and having friendly economic relations, that benefits all of us. The only way they could, if they were to take policies to try and hurt Alberta for leaving, that would hurt them too. It would hurt their economy. It would drive their economy down. It would drive their standard of living down. So are they really going to sacrifice themselves just for the sake of hurting us? Like it doesn't make sense rationally. So that the process of negotiating with Canada and working out deals with Canada, whether it's complete independence like I favor or some other kind of deal, these can be done peacefully, and it's in everybody's best interests for them to be done peacefully and properly. So I don't think there should be any chaos or confusion or any kind of, nobody should be talking about violence or having an Alberta army or anything like that comes up sometimes, because there's absolutely no case for that. There's no reason for that. There's no precedent for that. There's no reason to talk about those kind of things.
So in this scenario, and I realize this is somewhat hypothetical, but in this scenario, let's talk about, for example, something like the national debt. Would that be a subject of negotiation between the new Alberta and the Canadian government in terms of us taking on a share of the national debt? Or are we I know I've heard this number, is it something like $660 billion that has left Alberta as part of equalization payments? Seems to me that's a pretty nice looking set off, using lawyer talk for a moment. But how would that unfold? Would that be part of the negotiation between the new Alberta and I guess the new Canada?
Yeah, like I'm certain that would be something that would be negotiated. Yeah, you refer to the figure, like Robert Manzel, who's a University of Calgary economist. He calculated, and actually this information is in a book called Moment of Truth. It's a really good book. He did like basically an academic article where he spells out the details of it, in economics terms. But from 1965 until 2018, during that period of time, Alberta has made a net contribution of $630 billion to Canada. And that's up to 2019. That's up to 2018. Wow. So Dr. Modry points out it's actually been more than that since. And some of the people with more economics background have talked about that if that money had been invested, when you go back all those years and all the accumulated interest over all the years, it would actually be well over $1 trillion or maybe even more. So we're talking a huge amount of money that Alberta has contributed. So that would definitely have to weigh in Alberta's favor, against the national debt, but the negotiations, that would definitely be one of the subjects of the negotiations. And I don't know enough about the numbers game as to how that would be played off, but it certainly seems to me Alberta's already made enough contribution to pay off the debt.
But in the aftermath, and they talk about this, of course, in the vision statement that I read from at the top of the show. The richest country in the world on a GDP basis, the freest country. Founding status for First Nations, focus on functional healthcare and education, taking care of the elderly, really every aspect of our society where Canada is failing. The APP, the new Alberta, would be flourishing and succeeding. So I have to say it's a very, very enticing and inspiring vision, and it seems to me eminently achievable. It really just needs human energy and commitment. It's going to have to take, quote unquote, massive action. Okay. But as I see, I've only been to one of the meetings, but based on what you're telling me, they're all the same. This is really spreading, and it's just these are exactly the kind of ideas that will spread quickly and take deep root. And so I think that's what's so inspiring about the vision. Anyway, I want to talk to you about, what I'd like to know is, let's say there's people listening to this, taking this in, and they want to find out more about the APP. Where would they go? Where should they look? They look on Facebook, on the website. How do they find out about these meetings? So if they want to attend?
Yeah, the website, I think it's albertaprosperityproject.com, but I can't say for sure. But if you search Alberta Prosperity Project in Google, it will definitely come up. And I think all of the information is there, including events information. Like there's a link, you click on the link and it'll list the upcoming events and where they are and what time they are and stuff. So that's where I go when I figure out where I'm going to go to. So, and also there's lots of research there. There's just so many materials there. That definitely they're using the website, I think, is the main container of all their information and their policies and things like that. So that's what I would recommend people to do, is go to the website.
Okay.
And also, actually,
So,
I'll just throw in, they do have a very active Facebook page too, though. Like if you're on Facebook, I mean, it doesn't
yeah,
have all the information that the website has, but
right.
it'll pop up. Like I get notifications when there's an event advertised or something. So
Yeah.
Facebook can be very helpful too.
They also post, I notice, very regularly on Twitter.
Oh, okay.
For people who are on Twitter. But let's talk about you for a second. You've written how many? 8 books you've written in all?
Like some of them are like little things. I don't really count books, but I've 5 or 6 books, kind of depending on how you do
Right,
it. So
right. So I noticed you have your own website where people can go and visit. So people want to go and find your books. They can visit your website, michaelgwagner.net. And can people purchase your books from that webpage, or where would they go if they want to purchase your books?
actually, the best place is a website called merchantship.ca. Like
Okay.
Merchant Ship is a small business based in Didsbury. It's a homeschooling business. They supply materials for home educators, and they carry my books there. They're friends of mine. So it's just a small business based in a small town in Alberta. Merchantship.ca, and all my books are available there. Also, my newest book, No Other Option, is available on Amazon. Amazon.ca
Nice.
or Amazon.com. So that makes it easy for people who want to do that. But all of the other books are, and that one too is available at merchantship.ca.
And you also sell some of your books are for sale at the meetings, right?
Yeah, I brought the 2 that are pertinent for Alberta independence, the No Other Option and Alberta Separatism. And then now I bring those to the meetings to sell. Yeah.
Great.
And
So, Michael, I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your knowledge today. I think, I've certainly learned a lot more about the EPP, and I'm sure that people who didn't know anything about it have a really wonderful historical perspective and political perspective, of why this is happening, why it's important for Alberta. And, it's also probably in the best interest of Canada. It's probably in the best interest of them, I don't want to say them, but let's say the central Canada and the East, because, a dysfunctional relationship is not good for anybody, is it?
mm-hmm.
I would think that in the aftermath, probably, or I would hope that the remaining part of Canada, if it's called that they would flourish too, because we wouldn't have all this dissension and discord and disquiet running through the political discourse. But I want to talk about, this is part of the show where we get down to what we call the reading list. This is where we try and leave people with an idea of where to go, where to access materials, a website, a book, an essay, or something that will allow them to further their discovery and maybe extend the conversation. So fortunately, you've written a number of books. And so what I'm going to recommend today, you'll be glad to hear, are your books, the ones we've been talking about. So Alberta Separatism, this book, I'm just going to read the summary. Alberta Separatism has been out of the news for many years, but that may soon change. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was the father of Alberta separatism because he provoked an angry response with his national energy program and other socialistic policies. And then it says his son Justin has now become the new Liberal Prime Minister, maybe just a matter of time before Alberta is once again at odds with the federal government. Well, that was prescient. If so, there will be a conflict and Alberta separatism will see a revival. And he says this book, the only one of its kind, describes the background and history of Alberta separation. Most Albertans are patriotic Canadians, but they won't be pushed around by the federal government, especially when the federal government threatens their livelihoods through attacks on the oil industry. Read how Albertans have fought back in the past and expect the same if Prime Minister Justin Trudeau comes knocking, and he's more than knocking. The wolf is, he's growling at the door. So, why don't you tell us about No Other Option?
Okay, No Other Option is a book that came out last year. Actually, I wrote that one partly because people who had read Alberta Separatism Then and Now, like it was completed in 2009. So the information is historical and wasn't up to date, so to speak. So people would say, you got to update that book. But I'd found so much information in the meantime. I said, no, instead of updating my first book, I'm going to create a different book altogether, which would have updated information. There's a chapter in No Other Option, which kind of updates Alberta separatism then and now, although it's just a small chapter. The purpose of No Other Option is to make the case that Alberta needs to become independent. Like I go through some of that historical stuff, some of the proposals and how we've tried to make changes. And I talk about how actually there's a chapter in there about how Alberta is somewhat culturally distinct from the rest of Canada. I mean, I don't want to make this point too strongly, but there is like academic material on how the idea of Canadian identity in the West is somewhat different from the idea of Canadian identity in Ontario. And also one of the important points is, and I don't know how many people realize this, I know I didn't until I studied this, but in the early, like because of immigration patterns, when Alberta was being formed in the early 20th century, about 20% of Alberta's population was American born. Like we had a much heavier American influence in Alberta than any other province by far, because the American frontier closed off first, and in Canada, Alberta was the last part of the frontier to close off. So many Americans, the American frontier closed, so they came into Alberta, as settlers, as pioneers. So we had a very heavy influence of Americans, right from the very beginning. And then also too, then when oil was discovered, as I mentioned, it was American companies that came up to develop Alberta's oil industry. And a lot of those Americans, were from Western United States for conservative ideas. And I mean, and it wasn't in terms of, there wasn't like a huge number of people that came up, but they were industry leaders. They were, company presidents and geologists. So they were influential people and they had conservative ideas. So it was kind of like a second wave of more conservative ideas from the United States. And I'm just introducing these as examples of how this kind of immigration influenced Alberta's culture to make Alberta somewhat different from the rest of Canada. People talk about how Alberta has historically voted more conservative than the rest of the country and how some other attitudes in Alberta are more conservative than the rest of the country. Well, it's not a coincidence. You can read some of the history as to why that happened. And so I just wanted to put in some of the cultural distinctiveness of Alberta in the book too, because it's, for the most part, independence ideas are based on the economy. Like we're concerned about what the federal government's doing to our economy. And in order to get our economic freedom, we need to become independent. And that's all true. And that's been the main driver. But it's helpful too to have an Alberta identity based on our history and our traditions that are somewhat different from the rest of Canada. We can have some kind of identification with our province that goes beyond financial identification. That we can love Alberta not just because it helps us financially, but because we have something here that's different, something we can embrace, the cowboy kind of culture or whatever, however you want to describe it. But we are somewhat different that way. And there's going to be more than just the financial reason for us to become independent. We have to have like a positive vision of what our province is and our history and traditions, as a part of the motivation for being different or being independent from the rest of Canada. So I threw in a big chapter about that. I also talk about why I don't believe the Conservative Party, is the answer. As I mentioned earlier, they make things better for us, but it's just a temporary reprieve. And then I talk about the secession reference decision, why that's so important, and how that has made a peaceful pathway, to independence possible. And I just kind of summarize it. One of the things that has come up in the past with Alberta independence movements is the idea that if we had, some kind of a leader, like a rallying leader, like the way that René Lévesque was in Quebec, like before René Lévesque was leader of independence movement in Quebec, the Quebec independence movement was really divided. There was all kinds of different groups and things like that. And René Lévesque, there was something special about him, in terms of his appeal to people, and he really brought the movement together and took it forward. And I mean, even in Alberta's history, when we look at the Social Credit Party, if you remember, that was basically almost single-handedly created by William Aberhart. He was a famous radio Bible teacher, like one of the pioneers of radio evangelism in the world.
Bible Bill.
Bible Bill Aberhart. He was a high school principal, and on his free time, he did radio evangelism, and he had a Bible college, and he became famous because of his use of the radio. And during the Depression, one of his students committed suicide. It made him interested. We need a solution for the Depression. And he got interested in social credit. He promoted on his radio program, and he created the Social Credit Party. And his first election, he became the premier in a landslide election. And it's impossible to think of that happening without him. And he was a very popular speaker. His meetings would bring in hundreds of people. So I'm just trying to illustrate that if you get the right kind of person at the right time, they can really pull something together. So perhaps that would be beneficial for Alberta too. If we had the right kind of person come along to lead the movement and maybe draw together some of these disparate groups that aren't working together. I don't know if that can happen, but I know people have talked about that over the years, that something like that would be beneficial for the movement if we had someone like that, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm drifting again.
No, that certainly is. The one thing you mentioned is that the APP certainly has is a positive and inspiring vision, and it is growing. I was talking with Dr. Modry yesterday. He was telling me about a group of people from APP are going out to Swift Current because there's great interest in Saskatchewan, and I understand there's a British Columbia chapter that's on the way. So, great ideas, as you know, they spread. And so this is a tremendous concept. And as I said, very, very inspiring. And I think it provides hope to people who in this part of the country are in great despair. That's what happens when you're in a prolonged dysfunctional relationship is, despair and depression sets in. There's a hopelessness. And what I sense when I go to these meetings, and I feel it just as you do, that sense of hope and inspiration that, there is something we can do. But we've got to be brave. It's going to be hard work. It's not going to be easy. And we have to be vigilant and peaceful. But there is a path forward. Well, I just want to thank you again for taking the time to appear with us today. I know you're very busy. Just 11 children alone and homeschooling. Of course, they couldn't have a better teacher. And I have no doubt that your wife is just as wonderful as you are. But thank you so much for being with us today. I know anyone taking this in has enjoyed a very meaningful conversation and has learned a lot about our province and the history of our country, and also been presented with a very inspiring vision of what can change if we have the right ideas and if we have the courage to pursue them. So thank you so much, Dr. Wagner, for being with us today on Grey Matter. It's been a great pleasure to host you today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I just want to throw in that my wife does most of the homeschooling. I want to give her the credit. She's the one who deserves the credit for, having the kids and homeschooling and stuff.
Mrs. Wagner. Awesome.
Yes, she is a wonderful woman, as you mentioned. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And it was really great to meet you in Airdrie as well.
Yes, I look forward to seeing you again at some of these meetings. Best of luck, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.